Welcome to the deep dive. In an age where, information just floods us from all directions, wouldn't it be great to cut through the noise? To really grasp complex topics, moving beyond just skimming the surface. That's exactly our mission today. We're doing a deep dive into something that impacts every single one of us, often without us even realizing it. Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act, or PDPA, it's basically the rule book for how organizations handle your personal info.
Exactly. And look, to make this really clear and actionable for you, whether you're just interacting with services or maybe you're managing data inside an organization, we've basically boiled down the core insights from, well, a whole stack of crucial documents. We're talking the Act itself, advisory guidelines, even infographics. The goal really is to cut through the jargon and show what actually matters.
Yeah, our aim for this deep dive is to pull out those surprising facts, maybe deliver some genuine aha moments, and leave you feeling properly informed, without that feeling of information overload. So let's get started.
Okay, first up, we all hear personal data thrown around constantly, but it can be surprisingly broad, right? What exactly does the PDPA consider personal data, and maybe what are some things people don't realize fall under it?
That's a really crucial starting point because, yeah, it is broader than many people think. Under the PDPA, personal data is defined as any data, whether it's true or not, about an individual who can be identified. And that identification can happen either from that data alone or, from that data combined with other info an organization has access to or is likely to get access to. The key thing here is that the term isn't narrow. It covers, everything from your name and NRIC to your IP address, your location data, even your voice or your picture in a video if they can link it back to you. And it covers data in electronic form or any other form, really. So it's not just the obvious stuff like name and address. Okay. What about things that seem like they should be personal data, but maybe aren't under the Act?
Good question. A common one is business contact info. The PDPA specifically excludes business contact information. So your name, job title, work phone, work address, work email, even your work fax number, remember those?
Yeah.
That's generally not personal data under the Act, unless you provided it solely for personal reasons.
Oh, okay. So my work email signature isn't usually covered.
Right. In most business contexts, no. Also, and this might surprise some folks, the PDPA generally doesn't apply to data of people who've been deceased for over 10 years, though I should add other legal rules might still apply to that info.
Okay, so with all this data flying around, who's actually responsible for it? Is it like, do I own my data like I own my phone?
It's less about ownership in that sense and more about control. That's the key concept. The PDPA puts the responsibility squarely on organizations for the personal data in their possession or under their control. Control, not ownership. That's fundamental. An organization itself is pretty broad. It includes companies, associations, even individuals acting in a professional capacity, like a freelancer. But there's an important exception. Individuals acting purely in a personal or domestic capacity.
What if for my family photos?
Exactly. Your personal photo album isn't subject to the PDPA's main rules. But if you run a small online shop from home, that business would be covered.
And who's the watchdog? The main body in Singapore, making sure everyone follows these rules and holding organizations accountable.
That would be the Personal Data Protection Commission, the PDPC. It was actually set up under the PDPA itself. Its main jobs are promoting awareness, giving guidance, and, crucially, administering and enforcing the Act. They're the ones you'd complain to, and they're the ones making sure organizations toe the line.
All right, foundation laid. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. The PDPA essentially has 10 main obligations for organizations. We should probably unpack some of the really critical ones, and, we have to start with consent, don't we? It feels like the absolute bedrock of data protection. But what makes consent valid under PDPA? Because it's not just checking a box, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. It's much more nuanced than just a simple checkbox. For consent to be valid, an organization has to get it from the individual for a specific, limited purpose. And they must clearly notify the person about that purpose beforehand. And here's a really critical insight. An organization can't force you to consent to collection, use, or disclosure of data beyond what's reasonable just to get a product or service.
The take it or leave it approach isn't okay if the it includes unrelated data use.
Precisely.
Can you give an example? Because that sounds like where things could easily go wrong.
Sure. Think about Sarah signing up for a spa package. If the spa says, okay, you can get this discount, but only if you agree to us selling your contact details to, say, 10 different marketing companies.
Right.
That consent would likely be invalid because selling her data isn't reasonably necessary for providing the spa service itself. And another key point. Consent is explicitly not valid if it's obtained using false or misleading information or, dodgy practices. It has to be genuinely informed and voluntary.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But then there's this idea of deemed consent. That sounds a bit automatic, like consent by default. How does that work without undermining control?
Yeah, deemed consent can sound a bit tricky, but it's quite specific. It basically applies when your actions reasonably imply you've consented. The Act says it's when an individual voluntarily provides the personal data for that purpose, and it is reasonable that the individual would voluntarily provide the data for that specific purpose.
Okay, so
Like when Sarah pays for her spa package with a credit card, she's voluntarily providing the card details for payment. It's reasonable to assume she consents to those details being sent to the bank to process the payment, right?
Right.
Or, say, Benjamin donates to a charity online and gives his NRIC address and bank details for a GIO deduction and to get tax relief. Consent is deemed for those specific purposes he was told about.
Right.
The key is reasonable expectation tied to a clear, limited purpose. And this deemed consent extends to others needed in the chain for that purpose, like the bank processing the donation.
Okay, so I give consent, maybe expressly, maybe it's deemed. But what if I change my mind later? Can I just pull the plug?
Absolutely. You have a clear right to withdraw consent. You just need to give the organization reasonable notice. Now, the organization has to tell you what the likely consequences of withdrawing are. Maybe they can't provide the service anymore if it relied on that data. But crucially, they must not prohibit you from withdrawing. They can't stop you. Once you do, they have to stop collecting, using, or disclosing that data. And importantly, they also have to tell their data intermediaries and agents, anyone else handling the data for them, that you've withdrawn consent.
Are there situations where consent isn't needed at all? I guess there must be exceptions, right? Emergencies, maybe.
Yes, exactly. There are quite a few exceptions. Emergencies are a key one, threats to life, health, or safety. Another common one is publicly available personal data, though organizations should still be careful how they use that. Contacting next of kin is another exception. Then there's evaluative purposes. For instance, a school, let's call it School ABC, wouldn't need specific consent from a student, Marie, to use her grades or peer feedback when deciding on a bursary application. That's considered evaluation.
Interesting. Any others?
Well, there are exceptions for historical and statistical research, but they come with very strict conditions. The research can't reasonably be done without identifiable data. There has to be a clear public benefit. The results can't negatively impact the individual directly, and any published results must not identify anyone. There's also the legitimate interests exception and one for business improvement purposes. These allow organizations to use data for genuine operational needs without consent if they do a thorough assessment, balance their interest against your privacy rights, and take steps to mitigate risks. It's definitely not a blank check. They have to document this process.
Okay, so it's not just about getting consent, it's also about telling me why you need my data and doing it up front. That sounds like a big push for transparency.
It absolutely is. That's the notification obligation right there. Organizations must tell individuals the specific purpose or purposes for collecting, using, or disclosing their personal data. And this notification has to happen on or before they actually do it.
Not after the fact.
Exactly. And this ties directly into the purpose limitation obligation. Data can only be collected, used, or disclosed for purposes a reasonable person would consider appropriate.
Yeah.
And importantly, only for purposes they've already told you about. It stops scope creep, collecting data for X and then suddenly using it for Y and Z without telling you.
How do they have to notify me? Is there a specific format?
No single prescribed way, actually. But good practice and what the PDPA looks for is clear, easily accessible information, usually in writing. Think of the data protection policy or privacy policy links you see on websites. That's typically where they lay out the purposes. The main thing is that you, the individual, shouldn't be left guessing why they want your data.
Right. Now, what about my rights as an individual? Can I actually see the data an organization holds on me, and can I fix it if it's wrong? This feels pretty fundamental.
It absolutely is fundamental. This comes under the access obligation. Upon your request, organizations generally must provide you with the personal data they have about you, whether they possess it or just control it. They also have to give you information about how that data might have been used or disclosed within the past year.
So I can see who they shared it with.
Generally, yes. Information about how it may have been used or disclosed. But importantly, they don't have to give you the actual internal documents that contain your data, just the personal data itself. And if the data is already easily available to you, like through an online account portal, they can just point you there.
How quickly do they have to respond if I ask for my data?
The rule is as soon as reasonably possible. If they can't manage it within 30 days, they have to tell you in writing why not and when they will be able to respond.
Can they charge me for this?
Yes, they can charge a fee for access requests. But, and this is important, they have to give you a written estimate of the fee first. They can't proceed until you agree to pay it. Now, there are some significant exceptions to this access right. You generally can't access data held solely for evaluative purposes. Think raw exam scripts before results are out. Access can also be denied if providing it would threaten the safety or physical or mental health of another individual. And, crucially, if your data was disclosed to a specific prescribed law enforcement agency for an investigation.
They can't tell me.
Correct. The organization is prohibited from informing you about that specific disclosure to avoid compromising ongoing investigations. Then you have the correction obligation. If you spot errors or omissions in your data, you have the right to request a correction. The organization generally must correct it unless they have reasonable grounds not to. And here's a key follow-on. If they do correct your data, they generally need to send that correction to other organizations they shared the original incorrect data with in the past year.
So the correction spreads.
Exactly, unless it's just not practicable for them to do so. It helps ensure accuracy across the board.
So beyond fixing errors when I point them out, how accurate does my data need to be kept generally? Is there an ongoing duty for the organization?
Yes, definitely. That's the accuracy obligation. Organizations have to make a reasonable effort to ensure the personal data they hold is accurate and complete. This is especially important if they're using that data to make decisions that affect you, like a loan application or a job opportunity, or if they're disclosing it to others. Think about John applying for a promotion. If he gets new qualifications, the company should make a reasonable effort to ensure his record reflects that accurately, especially if those qualifications matter for the promotion decision. It's about maintaining data quality.
Okay, let's talk security. This is a huge concern for everyone, obviously. How does the PDPA ensure my data is actually kept safe? What kind of measures should organizations have?
This falls under the protection obligation, and it's a big one. Organizations must implement reasonable security arrangements. The goal is to protect personal data from all sorts of bad things: unauthorized access, collection, use, disclosure, copying, modification, disposal, or even accidental loss. Now, the key word here is reasonable. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. What's reasonable depends heavily on the sensitivity of the data and the organization's resources and context.
So a small shop versus a bank would have different expectations.
Exactly. But generally, these arrangements should cover a few areas. Strong internal policies and procedures are vital. Regular, mandatory staff training is key here. People are often the weakest link. Organizations should also think about data minimization, only holding the data they actually need. Then you have physical measures, locked filing cabinets for paper records, restricted access to server rooms, and of course a whole range of ICT measures. Strong passwords, encryption for sensitive data, up-to-date antivirus, maybe privacy filters on screens, things like whitelisting specific IP addresses that can access cloud resources, and conducting regular security audits to check for vulnerabilities. It's about building layers of defense.
Makes sense. A layered approach. Okay, and speaking of holding data, how long can they keep it? Can they just hang on to my data forever?
No. Definitely not forever. That's where the retention limitation obligation comes in. Organizations have to cease to retain documents containing personal data, or alternatively remove the means to link that data back to an individual, as soon as it's reasonable to assume two things. One, the original purpose for collecting the data is no longer being served. Two, retention is no longer necessary for other legal or business purposes.
So there's no fixed time limit, like delete after 7 years?
Nope. No fixed duration. It's all based on reasonableness and the specific purpose it was collected for. Anonymization is a common way to deal with this. If they properly anonymize the data so it can't identify you anymore, they can often keep the anonymized data set for things like statistical analysis without violating this obligation.
Okay, switching gears slightly, NRIC numbers, they're incredibly sensitive here in Singapore, aren't they? Almost like a master key. What are the really strict rules around collecting or using them? I know this changed a few years back.
You're absolutely right. NRIC numbers get special attention because they're so sensitive and unique. The general rule now is that organizations are generally not allowed to collect, use, or disclose NRIC numbers or copies of NRIC. Full stop.
It's generally not allowed.
Okay, this is a big shift aimed at reducing the risk if there's a data breach. Widespread collection just increases potential harm. However, there are two very specific, narrow exceptions where it is permitted. First, if it's required under the law. For example, certain licensed businesses like massage establishments need it for compliance, or private schools might need it by law to verify student identities during enrollment.
Okay, required by law. What's the second one?
Second, it's allowed only when it's necessary to accurately establish or verify the identities of the individuals to a high degree of accuracy. This usually applies to situations involving significant risk or potential fraud, where you absolutely need certainty about who someone is. Think critical healthcare situations or high-value financial transactions requiring very strong proof of identity. It's a high bar.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about something that drives pretty much everyone crazy. Unwanted marketing messages, robocalls, spam texts. How do the PDPA's do not call or DNC provisions protect us?
Ah, yes, the DNC registry. This tackles specified messages, basically marketing or promotional messages about goods, services, land, business opportunities, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it applies to messages sent to Singapore telephone numbers, whether it's a voice call, a text message like SMS or MMS, or even a fax.
People still use fax for marketing?
Apparently so, it's still covered. The main rule is simple. Organizations must not send a specified message unless they've checked the relevant DNC register and confirmed your number is not listed.
So they have to check first.
They have to check unless they have your clear and unambiguous consent to receive that specific type of message. And that consent needs to be really specific. Something like, "Tick here to receive SMS updates about our weekly special offers." That's likely specific enough for DNC. But a vague phrase like, "You consent to us using your data for marketing purposes," that's generally not specific enough for DNC consent. They'd still need to check the registry if they relied only on that.
Are there any exceptions? Like if I'm already a customer?
Yes, there are a few key exceptions. Messages related to a transaction you previously agreed to enter into are generally okay. Also, messages sent as part of an ongoing relationship, like your bank sending you account updates, are usually fine, provided the message's sole purpose relates to that relationship. And messages whose only purpose is genuine market research or market survey are typically exempt from the DNC check requirement. One last thing. Even if a message is allowed, it still must include clear and accurate information, identifying the sender and giving you contact details for things other than just unsubscribing.
Okay, cameras. They're everywhere now, aren't they? Smartphones, CCTVs on every corner, body cams. When does my image, or maybe even my voice captured on these devices, become personal data under the PDPA? And how does consent work with that?
Yeah, it's a really relevant question today. The PDPA is clear. An individual can be identified from their voice or their voice combined with other information, or certainly their voice coupled with their image, like in a video. So yes, your image and voice recordings can definitely be personal data.
So if an organization holds an event and takes pictures,
For photo taking at, say, private functions they organize, like a company dinner, good practice is for them to clearly state beforehand, maybe in the invitation or with signs at the event, that photos will be taken for a specific purpose, like for our internal newsletter. Your attendance and participation after that notice could imply consent.
what about CCTVs? Security cameras watching public spaces or inside buildings?
It's a bit different for CCTVs. For cameras monitoring areas open to the public, like a shopping mall concourse, organizations might sometimes rely on the publicly available data exception for collection. However, the PDPC still considers it good practice to notify people that surveillance is happening, usually with clear signs.
Smile, you're on camera.
Pretty much. Now, for CCTVs in private areas inside an office, maybe a restricted part of a facility, organizations usually can't rely on the publicly available exception. They might instead rely on the legitimate interest exception if the surveillance is for, say, security or safety reasons. But they have to meet all the conditions for that exception, including assessing the impact on privacy and ensuring it's proportionate. They can't just put cameras anywhere without justification.
Right. Now, lots of organizations use third parties to handle data, right? Cloud providers, maybe a payroll company. These are called data intermediaries. What happens then? Does the original company get off the hook for responsibility?
No, absolutely not. And this is super important. A data intermediary is basically an organization processing personal data on behalf of another organization.
Yeah.
Like you said, cloud providers, outsourced IT support, payroll processors.
Okay.
So if school ABC uses vendor OPQ to manage its student database in the cloud, vendor OPQ is the data intermediary. But And this is the crucial part. The PDPA states very clearly that the engaging organization, School ABC in our example, is still responsible for complying with all obligations under the PDPA for the data handled by its intermediary.
So they can outsource the task, but not the ultimate responsibility.
Exactly. They remain accountable. Now, while the main organization is fully accountable, the data intermediaries themselves do have direct obligations under the PDPA for the data they process. Specifically, they're subject to the protection obligation, keeping it secure, the retention limitation obligation, not keeping it too long, and the data breach notification obligation, telling the main organization if they discover a breach.
So there's shared responsibility, but the buck stops with the original organization.
That's a good way to put it. This also leads into the transfer limitation obligation. If an organization sends personal data overseas, maybe to a data intermediary using servers in another country, they have to take steps to ensure that data is protected to a standard that's comparable to the PDPA back here in Singapore.
How do they do that?
Well, they need to do their homework. For instance, they might check if the overseas recipient is certified under a recognized scheme like the APEC Cross-Border Privacy Rules, CBPR system, or put legally binding contracts in place that enforce PDPA comparable standards. They can't just send data abroad and hope for the best. They need proper due diligence.
Okay, this next one sounds really futuristic. Synthetic data. What on earth is that, and how does it relate to data protection? Is it like fake data?
It does sound sci-fi, doesn't it? But it's becoming a really practical tool. Synthetic data is essentially artificial data. It's generated using algorithms, often AI or machine learning models, specifically designed to mimic the characteristics and structure of real source data. The key thing is, good quality synthetic data should reflect the statistical properties and patterns found in the real data. But crucially, it doesn't contain any actual information traceable back to real individuals.
So it looks and behaves like real data statistically, but isn't actually anyone's real info.
Exactly.
So why use it? How does it help with privacy?
Well, its main advantage is significantly reducing re-identification risks, since there's no real person's data in the synthetic set. The privacy risks of using that data for things like testing new software, training AI models, or doing exploratory analysis are massively lowered, almost eliminated. It lets organizations unlock insights from data patterns without putting actual individuals' privacy on the line. Now, creating it often involves using techniques based on anonymization principles applied to the original data first. Things like record suppression, removing very unusual records that might stand out, or pseudonymization, replacing names or IDs with codes. If that's reversible, the key linking the codes back to real people must be kept extremely securely, of course. And data perturbation, slightly tweaking values like age ranges or income brackets to fuzz the details. There's also this concept called K-anonymity. Think of K as a privacy level. If a dataset has, say, 5 anonymity, it means for any combination of identifying attributes you look at, like age, postcode, gender, there are always at least 5 individuals in the dataset who share those exact attributes.
Making it harder to single someone out.
Precisely. A higher K, like 5 or more, gives stronger privacy, may be better for sharing data outside the organization. A lower K, maybe 3, might be okay for internal analysis. But it's not magic. The usefulness depends on how well the synthetic data mimics the real patterns. And the process of generating the synthetic data might still involve processing the original personal data initially.
So you still need to be careful at that stage.
Right. A data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, might be needed for the generation process itself to manage any risks involved there.
Okay, so we've talked about all these measures: protection, consent, accuracy. But sometimes things still go wrong. Data breaches happen. What's the protocol then? That oh no moment. Who has to be told and how quickly?
Right, the data breach notification obligation. This is critical and time sensitive. First off, if it's a data intermediary that discovers the breach affecting data they handle for someone else, they must notify that main organization without undue delay. They can't sit on it. Then the organization that controls the data has to assess if it's a notifiable data breach.
And what makes it notifiable?
2 main triggers. It's notifiable if the breach is likely to result in significant harm to the individuals affected. Or, second trigger, if it involves certain prescribed types of personal data, usually very sensitive stuff, or affects a prescribed number of affected individuals. Currently, that threshold is 500 or more people.
What counts as significant harm?
The guidelines give examples. Data about vulnerable people, like kids under child protection, specific sensitive medical info, like records of abuse, or certain financial data, credit scores, account balances, income details, are all likely to meet that significant harm threshold. If the assessment concludes it is a notifiable breach, the organization has a strict deadline. They must notify the PDPC as soon as practicable, but in any case no later than 3 calendar days after they finish that assessment.
3 days, that's fast.
It is. And they generally also need to notify the affected individuals so those people can take steps to protect themselves, like changing passwords.
Are there exceptions to notifying individuals?
Yes, a few. For instance, if the organization acted quickly and took remedial actions that successfully prevent significant harm, or if notifying individuals would somehow compromise a law enforcement investigation, or if the PDPC itself directs them not to notify individuals for some reason, and how they notify individuals matters too. It should be in the individual's best interest. For very sensitive breaches, maybe personal phone calls by trained staff are more appropriate than just a generic email blast.
Can organizations do anything proactively when a breach happens, maybe to soften the blow with the PDPC? Show they're taking it seriously.
Yes, there's a provision for voluntary undertakings. This is basically an option where, instead of jumping straight into a formal investigation and potential penalties, the PDPC might accept a formal undertaking from the organization. This usually happens if the organization can demonstrate it already had accountable policies and practices in place. Maybe they have the IMDA Data Protection Trustmark certification, for example.
Yeah.
And crucially, they need to present a solid remediation plan to address the breach and prevent recurrence. If the PDPC accepts the undertaking, it allows the organization to fix things proactively, showing responsibility, possibly avoiding immediate enforcement action. It encourages accountability and improvement.
Makes sense. Okay, beyond these specific rules, who's actually in charge of compliance within a company? Is there like a designated person?
Yes, absolutely. This falls under the overarching accountability obligation. The PDPA requires every organization subject to the Act to designate one or more individuals to be responsible for ensuring the organization complies with the PDPA. This person is typically called the Data Protection Officer, or DPO.
The DPO.
Right. The DPO's role is really key. They oversee the data protection strategy, they monitor risks, they handle staff training, they liaise with the PDPC, manage access requests, and so on. But accountability isn't just the DPO's job. The organization as a whole needs to develop clear data protection policies and operational procedures. And very importantly, they need to communicate these effectively to all staff, usually through regular training. Compliance really has to be embedded in the culture.
So what are the consequences if an organization doesn't comply? What teeth does the PDPA actually have?
Oh, it definitely has teeth. The PDPC has significant enforcement powers. They can launch a review or an investigation if they suspect a breach. Based on their findings, they can issue directions, basically, legally binding orders telling the organization to do specific things like stop collecting certain data or fix a security flaw or even destroy data collected improperly. And they can also impose financial penalties.
How big can those penalties be, and what do they look at when deciding?
The potential penalties could be quite substantial, potentially up to 10% of annual turnover in Singapore for large organizations, or $1 million, whichever is higher, for significant breaches. When deciding the amount, the PDPC considers several factors. Did the organization try to mitigate the harm? How quickly and effectively did they respond? Do they have a history of non-compliance? And a big one, did the organization actually gain any financial benefit or avoid any financial loss because of the non-compliance? For instance, deliberately selling personal data illegally for profit would be seen as a major aggravating factor. The PDPC usually publishes its decisions, or at least a summary, so there's public transparency.
And can organizations fight these decisions?
Yes, there's an appeal process. They can ask the Commission for reconsideration, then appeal to the Independent Data Protection Appeal Committee, and ultimately they can appeal to the High Court, but usually only on a point of law. And one more thing to mention on enforcement. The PDPA also includes specific offenses for egregious mishandling of personal data. This is important because it targets individuals within organizations, not just the organization itself. It covers situations where an individual engages in knowing or reckless unauthorized disclosure of personal data, or uses it improperly for a gain, or to cause a harm or a loss to someone else.
So individuals can be personally liable too?
Yes, for serious, deliberate mishandling. The penalties for individuals can include fines up to $5,000, imprisonment for up to 2 years, or both. It really underscores that data protection is everyone's responsibility within an organization.
Wow. Okay, what a journey through the PDPA. That was genuinely comprehensive. We've covered so much ground, from the absolute basics, what is personal data, through the core obligations like consent, protection, access, accuracy, all the way to these really specific modern issues like NRIC numbers, the DNC rules, CCTV, data intermediaries, and even that synthetic data concept.
Exactly. And the real hope here is that you, listening, now have a better sense not just of what the rules are, but why they matter. Because understanding this stuff really does empower you. Whether you're just deciding which apps to install or you're actually handling customer data at work, you're just better equipped to navigate this digital world and protect your own digital footprint.
Yeah, it really brings home that responsible data handling isn't just some corporate checklist item. It's fundamental to trust in this whole interconnected system we live in now. We're all part of this data ecosystem, aren't we?
Absolutely. And critically thinking about how your data gets collected, how it's used, how it's protected, that's not just a job for the data protection officers out there. It's really becoming an essential life skill for every single one of us to navigate the information age responsibly.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you personally? How does knowing more about these guidelines actually empower you to be a more informed digital citizen, maybe a better advocate for your own data rights in a world that's just becoming more and more data-driven every day? Definitely something to mull over as you go about your day. Well, that's it for this deep dive into Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act. We really hope you found it insightful and that it's given you plenty to think about.